as our guests Henry Blackaby and Richard Blackaby.
Aside your armor, don't remove.
The problem with a lot of Christians is they shrug their shoulders and say, well, I'm not a leader, so they sort of excuse themselves from making a positive difference.
The light as you go along, living with one foot in heaven, breaking the enemy's power. In the strength of Jesus we can stand in the darkest hour, living with one foot in heaven, ready when he calls our name. For believers to live is Christ, to die is only gain.
Welcome to Heritage of Truth. Today we have the honor to have as our guests Henry Blackaby and Richard Blackaby. They are both leaders in the Christian world. They're both prolific writers and ministry leaders. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourselves? I know that you have written a lot of books.
I have written a lot of books, and usually a book I write grows out of a felt need among God's people, especially the leaders of God's people. For instance, I sense that we have a crisis of spiritual leadership in the nation. And so out of that felt crisis, putting the leadership of God's people alongside the scriptures, and I always use the scriptures as my guide, I notice that Christian leaders are following the leadership books of the world. And the world will tell you how to get people to follow you. But Richard and I, as we thought through and prayed through this, we said, what would we define spiritual leadership to be? And our definition is moving people onto God's agenda. And that means you have to know what God's agenda is. And we've had a number of leaders come to us when they've read that and said, it means that we have to know when God is speaking to us. Well, how would we know the difference between God's voice and our voice? And of course, my first answer is, if you don't know the difference between the voice of God and your voice, you're in trouble at the heart of your Christian life. But then we would say, God does speak, and you have to know what he's saying, and then you have to deliver that message. All the way through the scriptures, God took the initiative to come to people when he wanted his people to have a word from him. Like Amos said, I wasn't a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but the hand of the Lord came upon me and he gave me a message and he told me where to deliver it, and I have. And so that same thing is true today. God wants the people, his people in America and the world, to know what's on his heart. So he comes to people, individuals, and calls them into a relationship with him. So you have to know when God is speaking, what he's saying, and where he wants you to deliver that. And that's the heart of our book on spiritual leadership.
And that's a classic book, but you chose to revise it recently.
Richard did.
And why did you feel there was a need to revise the book?
Well, we were certainly encouraged by how widely it had been used in the original edition. We could go to the Philippines or South Africa, and it was used as a textbook in Bible colleges, and CEOs here in America, and a lot of schools here used it. And so it was widely used, but the publisher came to us and said, you know, the 9/11 occurred just after our book came out, and all of society has been reevaluating leadership issues. And the internet, of course, is much more pervasive. Globally, nations are connected, so you could have a terrorist in Pakistan or Afghanistan that is terrorizing New York City. And to say, so if that's true in a negative side, then what does it also mean when you're a leader in a rural town in Kansas and you feel like God wants you to do something? It has global implications. And so we just felt that after 10 years since the book came out of teaching, writing, and speaking, God had shown us so much and the world had changed so much that we just, when they came and said this book continues to be used so widely, would you like to just take what you've learned in the last 10 years, what you've seen, how the world has changed, and would you like to just infuse that bring the book right up to date and expand it with stuff you didn't even think to write about earlier. We were delighted to do that. And so, you know, in 10 years of traveling around the world teaching and seeing God at work, there was a lot in our hearts to add. And so it's not just a tweaking sort of revision, expansion, it's a major, put everything on the table and sort of rebuild this and add everything we've seen in the last decade. And so we're very excited about it. We felt the first edition was really good, but we feel like now it's great.
That's great.
It has 2 new chapters.
Yeah.
Okay, and what are those 2 new chapters?
One is just dealing with change, which we felt pretty appropriate since 9/11 and all that has changed. I feel like a lot of times if you watch a leader that gets fired or in great trouble, it's oftentimes at the point of when they try to change something. And so we just felt like in this day, you have to know how to bring about change because you'll be doing that constantly. And the other is just working with people. We felt like, again, if there's a troubled area with leaders, it's trying to work with different kinds of people. And in our society now, it used to be a fairly homogeneous sort of workforce, but now you've got people from so many backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, and just some that grew up in very unchristian homes, some that are still from the Bible Belt. You've got all kinds of different people. It's very challenging today to try to build a cohesive team when people are coming from such diverse places in their own life, and a lot of our leaders just can't do it. I mean, and so you've got very fractured organizations, fractured country, and so what kind of leader does it take that can draw very diverse people together, where they're bonded together and have the same vision, the same direction? And so those are the 2 major chapters, and then within each chapter we just added a lot of subsections that brought it up to date.
The leadership problem is not just in business, it's also in families.
Oh, yeah.
And even the diversity within generations. I've heard that it's no longer between parent and child, it could be between a child and another younger child. So your book is also applicable to families, isn't it?
You know, we've spoken a lot at family meetings, parenting groups, homeschool groups, Christian groups, and certainly there's no greater leadership challenge that we'll face than with our own family. There's nothing more at stake. And I think it's so typical of what leaders at large are facing. Technology is changing. Now, you know, your kids, if I need to get hold of my daughter, tell her it's time for dinner, I'm more likely to text her than, you know, to holler throughout the hallways. And if you want to communicate with your kids, you may get a more meaningful Facebook message than you get by sitting and trying to get them to talk to you when they get home from school.
Isn't that sad?
And yet to say, but this is the world we're in now. This is the way they function. So you can wring your hands and say, I just can't relate to these kids today. Or as a leader, you say, so God, how do I need to adjust so that I continue to be effective and speak to the heart of the people I'm responsible for? And it doesn't mean that you just sort of do everything the world's way, but it does say, do you understand where people are at? Do you understand the way they think today? Do you understand what's important to them? And too many parents are saying, why would my kid just adapt to me? This is the way I function, this is the way I've always been comfortable. And not enough leaders are saying, so what will it take for me to connect with the people God's entrusted to me? And I'm not giving up until I've got one child that I connect with because they've got my temperament, but this kid here, I just can't, every time I try to correct, walls go up and we have a big fight. I just wish this child was like that child. And I would say, no, as a leader, you say, okay, I've connected with this one, but this one, God, I need your help to know what it will take so that this child knows that they're on my team too, and that I can help them thrive, and I can move them to be right where God wants them to be as well. And that's, to me personally, I've led at a lot of different levels, but leading in my home has been perhaps the most challenging, also the most rewarding place to ever exercise what it means to be a spiritual leader.
And I faced that with my oldest son.
Fortunately, he had a model child to begin with, and so that really was helpful
Are
to
you
the
the
other
oldest
children.
son?
And, you know, this whole proliferation of divorce
Oh, yes.
needs to be addressed, but addressed from the perspective of spiritual leadership. And we are doing that.
And it's challenging to see leaders who go to work face all kinds of challenges and problems, overcome it. They're fractured teams, they're bringing unity. Challenges come up unexpectedly, they work together to overcome it. And then they go home, and there's problems with their kids or problems in their marriage, and they don't take the same approach. And you'd say if there's anything that you're going to fight for, work for, be creative about, and problem solving about, it ought to be what's at home. And yet they'll overcome all kinds of challenges at work, and then just walk away from their marriage and say, I just think there's no hope.
What do you think is the answer for that? How can we encourage fathers especially?
Biblical principles of leadership.
Biblical principles.
Deny self.
I'm sorry?
Jesus said, deny self.
Deny self, yes.
Pick up your cross and follow me. And so we expand that and help people at home to understand what will it look like at home. If you're always insisting on your way, then you need to learn how to deny self, and you'll find that your marriage will turn around. So we take the biblical principles and then apply them carefully and specifically to the home and the family.
And it's knowing to hear from God. You know, I would tell anybody, I'll be speaking at a conference for people who've gone through, are facing divorce, and try to minister to people who've had broken marriages. And my response is not to be trite, but you know, God has a solution for every problem that you face. But have you really sought Him? And it's not always an easy solution. It may be difficult. It may take time. But too many people, they just decide, I can't see a solution, so I'm walking away. And I would say, did you really stay before God? Because He did know what it would take. He does know how to preserve it. He hates divorce. He hates when something He creates and puts together falls apart. But a lot of us have never really truly even sought Him. We just we're so angry, we're so upset, we've just shut it down and said there's no hope. And I would say, well, then you don't know the God I know. Because if you knew Him, you'd know there's always hope when you are hearing from Him. But would you even know how to hear what God was saying if you ask God, well, God, what do I need to do to save my marriage? And what do I need to change personally to help save my marriage? And then would you know how to hear what God replied as you asked Him that?
That's the heartbeat of the book we wrote, Experiencing God. And then we heard people saying they're having difficulty hearing from God, so we wrote the book, Hearing God's Voice. So when we see a need that's being expressed among the people of God, we say, is there anything that's on our heart that God had given us that we could write so that we can address this very issue? So in those two books especially, it comes out of what we have seen and felt among God's people. So
I want to encourage our listeners to get your book. Help me tell them how they, can they, just a regular Joe who's got a family, has some kind of, simple job at work. He may not be a leader at work. Can he benefit from reading your book?
Well, certainly we would say, because a spiritual leader is a person who exerts influence on people that God has given them. And so, as we said, if you're a parent, you need to be a spiritual leader. Don't wring your hands and say, well, I know I've got 5 kids, but I'm not a spiritual leader. I'd say, well, then start reading and learning and seeking God, because you have the greatest leadership responsibility you'll ever have. You may be at the lowest rung in your workplace, but does God want you to exert an influence? Didn't He say you're supposed to be salt and light? That means you're having an influence. If salt makes something better, it preserves things. So no matter where you are, if you're in your neighborhood, you need to just be a neighbor that makes the neighborhood better. So we would say the problem with a lot of Christians is they shrug their shoulders and say, well, I'm not a leader. So they sort of excuse themselves from making a positive difference. And that's why you can have polls that say that there's millions of Americans who claim to be Christian, yet society is morally deteriorating, spiritually deteriorating. And you'd say, well, why is it with this many Christians things keep getting worse and darker? And I would say it's because a whole bunch of Christians say, well, I'm not a leader. And what they're saying is, my life can't really make a difference. And I would say, you need to stand before God, read the Bible, see how many people were fishermen, they were farmers and just ordinary people, And then they realize, but when God puts his hand on you, he can change a world through a very ordinary person. And so what is it God wants to do through your life to make your world a better place? And don't settle for anything less than that. So certainly people can go to many different bookstores. Some of the bigger secular chains would have this leadership book. Our website is www.blackaby.org, and you can get it there. Go to the B&H website, lots of places to get it, but we'd encourage people, don't say, well, I'm not a leader, or I'm this, or I'm that. Just stand before God and say, with the one life you've given me, how do you want my life to make a difference? You could have put my life on this planet in any century, in any country, any place, but you put me at this time with these problems, and did you have a divine purpose that I need to find what that is and live my life so that whatever it is you wanted to accomplish through my life while I'm on this planet, I do that. And too many people are just existing, they're not living, they're not serving God the way they ought to. And so that's our challenge, is just, you don't have to be like this person, you don't have to get elected CEO of your company, but whatever it is God has in his heart for you, are you experiencing that? Are you settling for anything less than that?
So Spiritual Leadership is a book for everybody. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being my guest today.
It's our privilege.
It's our privilege.
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
For believers to live